In this video, we will be seeing about the sulci and gyri on the superolateral surface of cerebral hemisphere. This is the superolateral surface of cerebrum in both sides, on both sides. So now we are going to see the sulci. First we will see about the central sulcus. Where will you find this? This is the frontal pole, this is the occipital ball, approximately few centimeter posterior to the midpoint of these two poles. We can see the central sulcus cutting through the supromedial border of the cerebral hemisphere, and that is going down. The central sulcus is the boundary between the frontal and parietal lobes. It demarcates the primary motor and somatosensory areas of the cerebral cortex. It starts in or near the supromedial border of the cerebral hemisphere, as you have seen just now, and it runs sinuously towards the lateral sulcus. But usually it ends a little above the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. The central sulcus is usually a continuous sulcus in both the cerebral hemispheres. The central sulcus is also known as the central sulcus of Rolando. So here at this point will be the starting point where it cuts the supromedial border of the cerebral hemisphere and courses sinuously through the superolateral surface and ends just above the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. In front of the central sulcus, over this particular region, you can see another sulcus that will be known as the precentral sulcus. Here also this is the precentral sulcus, which is lying in front of the central sulcus. In between the central sulcus and precentral sulcus, you can see a gyrus. This particular gyrus, it will be known as precentral gyrus. This precentral gyrus contains the primary motor area. Now we will see the remaining sulci and gyri present on the frontal lobe. Here, this is the superior frontal sulcus. This is the inferior frontal sulcus. On the other side, this will be the superior frontal sulcus and this will be the inferior frontal sulcus. You have to remember, sulci and gyri of each cerebral hemisphere will be unique. It will not be like a book picture where you have a continuous straight line. This superior frontal and inferior frontal sulcus will be dividing the rest of the frontal lobe into superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus and inferior frontal gyrus. The further subdivisions of the inferior frontal gyrus we will be seeing sometime later. Now we have almost completed the sulci and gyri of frontal lobe. Now we can see the lateral sulcus. This is of left side and this will be the lateral sulcus over the right side. You can see it very clearly over there. It is also known as the lateral sulcus of Sylvius. It starts on the inferior surface of cerebrum and you can identify this area as the anterior perforated substance. This is the magnified view of anterior perforated substance. The stem of the lateral sulcus will be starting from this region and it goes forward and laterally, and over the superolateral surface of cerebral hemisphere it reaches this particular point. It is known as Sylvian point. From this Sylvian point we can see the stem of the lateral sulcus is further dividing into three rami. You can see the first rami, this is second one and this will be the third one. The first one, it is the anterior horizontal ramus, this is the anterior ascending ramus and this one will be the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. On the other side, this will be the anterior perforated substance. From this area, stem of the lateral sulcus will be directed forward and laterally to reach the Sylvian point, and at the Sylvian point this is the anterior horizontal ramus, this one, and this is anterior ascending ramus and this is the posterior ramus. Therefore, the inferior frontal gyrus is separated into multiple areas by this anterior horizontal, anterior ascending and posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. You can see the areas here. On the other side, here also you can see the division. This is the inferior frontal gyrus, and the area of the inferior frontal gyrus anterior to the anterior horizontal ramus will be known as pars orbitalis. This is pars orbitalis, and you can see the next area between anterior horizontal and anterior ascending ramus. This is anterior horizontal, this is anterior ascending, and this area will be known as pars triangularis. And the third portion between posterior ramus and anterior ascending ramus over here will be known as the pars opercularis. Now we have finished the frontal lobe. We have to see the parietal lobe, but before seeing that, we have to see the central sulcus again. You can see the central sulcus, which I am tracing it down with my thumb. You can see the central sulcus. Behind the central sulcus, you can identify another sulcus over this particular area over here and over here on this side. This sulcus will be known as the post-central sulcus. The post-central sulcus. Now, in between the central sulcus and the post-central sulcus, you have the gyrus, that is post-central gyrus. You can see it over here. The post-central gyrus contains the primary sensory area, which is the receiving end of all the sensations, majority of the sensations of our body. So, in the parietal lobe, we have post-central gyrus. Posterior to that, we have the post-central sulcus over here. The next sulcus in the parietal lobe here will be the intraparietal sulcus. Over the other side, this is the intraparietal sulcus, this particular area. This sulcus divides the rest of the parietal lobe into superior parietal lobule over here and inferior parietal lobule over this region. This is the sulcus, this will be superior parietal lobule, and this will be the inferior parietal lobule. Before proceeding further, we need to identify a sulcus which is present mainly on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, but is extending into the superolateral surface. That sulcus you can see over this area. Look at the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. This sulcus, it is known as the parieto-occipital sulcus. This parieto-occipital sulcus is, as you can see, it is extending onto the superolateral surface, and there is a gyrus surrounding that. And the gyrus surrounding the extension of the parieto-occipital sulcus on the superolateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere will be known as arcus parieto-occipitalis. Now we have finished the parietal lobe. We will move on to see the occipital lobe. In the occipital lobe, you have to give special care to identify the sulci and gyri. This is the arcus parieto-occipitalis. Now, in relation with the arcus parieto-occipitalis, you can see a sulcus over here. This is on the left side, this sulcus, and on the other side, this is the arcus. So, this is that particular sulcus, and this sulcus will be known as transverse occipital sulcus. Next important sulcus on the occipital lobe will be the lateral occipital sulcus. So you can see over here, this is the lateral occipital sulcus that will be dividing the occipital lobe into different gyri. On the other side, here will be the lateral occipital sulcus. You can see the gyri related to it. Next sulcus, this is the lunate sulcus, which is an example of operculated sulcus. Within the concavity of the lunate sulcus, we can see the extension of calcarine sulcus from the medial surface into the superolateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. We have finished the occipital lobe. We will move on to see the temporal lobe, as it is the next lobe present on the superolateral surface of cerebral hemisphere. In the temporal lobe, you can see mainly two sulci. This is the superior temporal sulcus, this is the inferior temporal sulcus, thereby dividing the temporal lobe into superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus and inferior temporal gyrus. On the other side, you can see the sulcus more clearly. Superior temporal sulcus over here, inferior temporal sulcus. You can see the superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus and the inferior temporal gyrus. Another important feature to mark here will be, this is a superior temporal sulcus. It is having an upturned edge posteriorly. You can see the upturned edge over here. This is the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. It is also having an upturned edge posteriorly. This is very clearly seen on this particular side. This is the upturned edge of the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. Here, this is the upturned superior temporal sulcus. This is the upturned posterior edge. Now, surrounding those upturned edges, we have some arc-shaped gyri. So, the arc-shaped gyri, which is surrounding the posterior ramus, posterior end, will be supramarginal gyrus over here. This one, this sulcus, this will be the supramarginal gyrus. And similarly, over the upturned edge of the posterior part of superior temporal sulcus, an arc-shaped gyrus over here. This is known as angular gyrus. So, with this, we have finished an outline of the sulci and gyri of superolateral surface of cerebral hemisphere.